The letter hit the table between them like a loaded gun. Louise Townsend kept her hands perfectly still, though every nerve in her body was screaming. Across from her, Harrison Blackwell, the man who had hired her, the man who had shaken her hand and smiled with all the warmth of a rattlesnake in Sunday boots, was no longer smiling. His face had gone the color of old ash, and his jaw worked silently as he stared at the document she had just placed in front of him. "You filed this," he said. "Not a question." "I did," Louise replied. Her voice was calm. It always was when she needed it to be. That was perhaps the most dangerous thing about her. She was quietest when she was most certain. "You filed a report that recommends the Territorial Land Office preserve the Rourke Ranch as a viable, fully operational cattle operation with documented water rights and legal boundary claims." He looked up at her, and what lived behind his eyes was not anger so much as disbelief. Pure, naked disbelief. "I hired you to find problems with it, Miss Townsend. I hired you to give me grounds to push that man off his land." "Yes," she said simply. "You did. Then what in the hell is this?" "That," Louise said, reaching forward and tapping the document with one steady finger, "is the truth, and I don't file anything else." The silence that followed was enormous. Harrison Blackwell was not a man accustomed to silence. He filled every room he entered with noise, his money, his connections, his reputation as the most powerful land speculator in the New Mexico Territory in the spring of 1883. He had built an empire by buying land cheap and ruining men who stood in the way, and he had never once had a hired assessor hand him a report that went against him, until Louise Townsend walked into his world. "You understand," he said softly, and the softness was more threatening than any shout, "that I will see to it you never work another land assessment contract in this territory." "I understand that," she said. "You'll lose everything." "I'll keep my integrity," she replied. "And in my experience, that's worth considerably more." She picked up her leather satchel from the floor beside her chair, stood, and walked out of Harrison Blackwell's office on a Tuesday morning in April without looking back. She did not let herself feel anything until she was 3 blocks down the main street of Santa Fe, the spring wind pulling at the loose strands of hair around her face, the dust from the street settling on the hem of her skirt. Then she stopped walking, closed her eyes, and breathed. She had just destroyed her livelihood to save a ranch that belonged to a man she had met exactly 6 days ago. A man she was very much afraid she had already fallen in love with. It had started, as most things worth telling do, with a train. Louise Townsend was 27 years old in the spring of 1883, and she had built her professional life with the kind of careful deliberateness that most people reserved for architecture. She was not the kind of woman who fell into things. She was the kind of woman who calculated every step, who studied soil compositions and water table maps and boundary surveys the way other women studied fashion plates, who had spent 3 years working alongside her father, a respected land assessor in St. Louis. Before his death left her the only person in the family who understood the work. She had inherited his instruments, his reference books, his reputation, and his list of contacts. What she had not inherited, because a woman never did in 1883, was the automatic respect that came with a man's name on the door. She had earned every contract through sheer, undeniable competence, through work so thorough and reports so accurate that even the men who were uncomfortable hiring a woman had to admit, grudgingly, that Louise Townsend was the best land assessor in the region, which was exactly why Harrison Blackwell had hired her. He had found her through a mutual acquaintance in Albuquerque, a land attorney named Simmons who vouched for her abilities with barely concealed jealousy. Blackwell had sent a telegraph to her boarding house in Santa Fe, offering 3 times her usual rate for a standard ranch assessment in the Southern Territory. The assessment, he explained in his careful language, was for a property he was considering acquiring. He needed a thorough evaluation of its assets, liabilities, and legal standing. Louise had accepted because 3 times her rate meant she could spend the next several months working only the cases she chose. She had not asked too many questions, because at that point, she did not know that Harrison Blackwell was a man whose questions always had dark answers. The railway brought her as far as the junction town of Mesilla, and from there, she hired a wagon driver to take her the remaining 12 miles south to the Rourke Ranch. It was the water that she noticed first. Before she saw the house, before she saw the cattle dotting the long grass of the southern pasture, before she saw any sign of human habitation, she saw the creek. It ran along the eastern edge of the property with the kind of steady, purposeful clarity that told an experienced assessor everything worth knowing about land. Water like that in New Mexico Territory in 1883 was not incidental. Water like that was the whole story. Then she saw the man. He came out from the barn as her wagon pulled up the long entrance road, and he moved with the particular economy of someone who had spent a lifetime doing physical work without ever wasting a motion. Wesley Rourke was 32 years old, broad across the shoulders, dark-haired and sun-bronzed, with the kind of face that had been weathered by years of outdoor living into something that went well beyond handsome into the territory of compelling. He wore a simple work shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow, and there was dust on his boots and something careful and guarded behind his dark eyes as he watched her wagon approach. He had not been expecting a woman. That much was obvious when she climbed down from the wagon and extended her hand, and he shook it with the brief, startled formality of a man recalibrating his expectations in real time. "Wesley Rourke," he said. "Louise Townsend," she replied. "I'm the assessor Mr. Blackwell engaged to evaluate your property." Something moved across his face then, a shadow, quick and complicated. "Blackwell sent a woman." "Blackwell sent me," she said pleasantly. "Would you like to begin with the East Pasture or the water rights documentation?" He studied her for a moment, and she met his gaze with absolute steadiness, because she had been meeting that gaze, the measuring, skeptical, show-me-something male gaze, her entire professional career. "The water rights," he said finally. "Come inside." The house was clean and plainly furnished, built of adobe in the Spanish territorial style, with thick walls that held the cool of the morning long into the afternoon. It was clearly a bachelor's home, no decorative touches, no curtains on the windows, furniture arranged for function rather than comfort. But there was a quality to it, a care taken with the maintenance of the structure that spoke of a man who respected what he had built. He spread the documents across the kitchen table without ceremony. Deeds, surveys, water rights claims, cattle records, grazing agreements with neighboring properties. It was one of the most complete sets of property documentation Louise had encountered in 3 years of assessments, and that itself told her something important. She sat down and began to read. Wesley Rourke made coffee without being asked and set a cup beside her without interrupting her work, and then went back outside. She noted that too. For the next 2 hours she read. And the more she read, the more uncomfortable a feeling began to settle in her chest, not because anything was wrong with the documentation. Quite the opposite. The Rourke Ranch was immaculate. The water rights claim had been legally filed in 1871, when Wesley Rourke's father, Thomas Rourke, had homesteaded the original claim under the terms of the Federal Homestead Act. The boundary surveys were accurate and verified by the Territorial Land Office. The cattle operation was profitable, the grazing land was well managed, the creek drew from a spring source that made it reliable year-round rather than seasonal. There was not a single legitimate problem with the Rourke Ranch, which meant the only reason Harrison Blackwell had hired her to find problems was because he intended to manufacture them. Louise set down her cup of coffee, which had gone cold, and stared at the documents for a long moment. Then she picked up her notebook and went outside to do her field work. Wesley was mending a section of fence along the south pasture when she found him. She walked the fence line toward him without calling out, studying the land as she went, making notes in her small leather-bound notebook with the efficient shorthand she had developed over years of field work. He watched her approach without stopping what he was doing. "You want to walk the property lines?" he asked when she was close enough. "I do," she said, starting with the east boundary along the creek. He set down his tools and walked with her. They covered the eastern boundary first, following the creek north, and Louise stopped frequently to take measurements, examine soil composition, note the condition of the creek bank. She was methodical and quiet and focused, and Wesley Rourke, she noticed, was smart enough to leave her to it without filling the silence with unnecessary conversation. After an hour, he said, "You're thorough." "I try to be," she said, making a note about the depth of the creek at the northern bend. "Most assessors I've dealt with spend an afternoon, ask a few questions, write their report. Most assessors don't have to be twice as thorough to be taken half as seriously," she said, not looking up from her notebook. There was a pause. Then, to his considerable credit, Wesley Rourke said, "That's fair." She did look up then. He was looking at the creek, not at her, his expression thoughtful rather than defensive. She turned back to her notes. "Tell me about this water source," she said, "the spring." "About a mile north of here," he said. "On federal land technically, but the flow rights were established with the original claim and registered before the land around it changed hands twice. The documentation should show that." "It does," she said. "I'm asking you to tell me about it." He was quiet for a moment, and then he began to talk about the spring the way a man talks about something he genuinely cares about, with a particular, specific kind of knowledge that comes only from years of direct relationship with a thing. He knew the spring's seasonal variation, the geology of the surrounding limestone that fed it, the way the flow increased in late winter from snowmelt in the distant mountains, and the way it never completely dropped below a certain level even in the driest summer. Louise wrote it all down and tried to ignore the fact that she liked listening to him talk. They walked the north boundary in the afternoon, and by the time they turned back toward the house as the light was starting to go golden and long, she had filled nearly a third of her notebook and had everything she needed to understand the property thoroughly. What she did not yet have was any understanding of why Harrison Blackwell wanted it. She found that answer the following morning, when she rode into the small town of Doña Ana for supplies and made the acquaintance of the postmistress, a sharp-eyed woman of 60 named Mrs. Garfield, who turned out to be one of those invaluable sources of local knowledge that existed in every small western town, and who required only the mildest encouragement to share what she knew. What Mrs. Garfield knew was this: Harrison Blackwell had been buying up land along the southern corridor of the Rio Grande Valley for the better part of a year. He had his eye on a railroad spur route that was rumored to be coming through the territory within the next 3 years, and he was positioning himself to own every significant piece of land along that route. The Rourke Ranch sat directly in the path of the proposed spur line. And Thomas Rourke, Wesley's father, had refused to sell to Blackwell's agent 6 months before he died. Wesley had inherited not just the ranch but his father's refusal. That was the hidden motive. That was the trap. Blackwell had not hired Louise to assess the land. He had hired her to provide him with an official assessor's report that he could use or misuse or manipulate to challenge the legal standing of the ranch and force a condemnation proceeding. She rode back to the ranch with this knowledge sitting like a stone in her chest. She found Wesley in the barn, doctoring a cut on one of the horses with practiced, gentle hands. She stood in the doorway and watched him for a moment, the careful way he worked, the low, steady sounds he made to keep the animal calm, and then she said his name. He looked up. "I need to ask you some things," she said, "and I need you to answer me honestly." "I've been honest with you," he said without defensiveness. "Do you know why Blackwell hired me?" The silence that followed that question was its own answer. He straightened slowly, keeping one hand on the horse's neck, and his expression had changed into something careful and closed. "I had my suspicions," he said. "He wants your land," she said, "for the railroad corridor." "I know. He's not buying. He's planning to force you out." Wesley turned and looked at her directly then, and there was something in his face that was not anger, or not only anger. It was the look of a man who has been carrying a weight for a long time and has simply grown tired of carrying it. "My father refused him," he said. "So do I know that too," she said. "So what are you going to do, Miss Townsend?" His voice was quiet, not threatening, not pleading, just asking. She looked at him for a long moment. The barn smelled of hay and horses, and the particular wormwood smell of an old building that had been well maintained, and the evening light was coming through the cracks in the boards in long, thin strips of gold. "I'm going to do my job," she said, "the way I was trained to do it." She went inside and wrote her field notes until midnight. The next 3 days were the most quietly extraordinary days Louise Townsend had spent in her professional life. She worked with her usual methodical intensity, but the work itself was revelatory. The Rourke Ranch was not merely sound, it was exceptional. The water table data she gathered with her hand auger, and the depth measurements she took at 5 separate locations along the property showed that the land sat over one of the most reliable aquifer systems she had encountered in the territory. The soil composition in the northern pasture was particularly strong for the region. The grazing rotation that Wesley employed, she observed it over 3 days and confirmed it against the cattle records, was more sophisticated than most operations 10 times the size. The man who had built this was not just a rancher. He was someone who understood his land with a depth of knowledge that went well beyond habit or inherited practice. He had thought about it, he had studied it, and he had built something that was genuinely, demonstrably excellent. She found herself wanting to know how he had come to understand it so well. She asked him on the 3rd evening, when they sat on the porch after supper. He had cooked, without ceremony, a plain but solid meal, and she had not offered to help because she had been working on her calculations at the kitchen table while he worked at the stove, and they had both simply found the arrangement natural. The sun was going down behind the western ridge, and the sky was doing things with color that she had not seen growing up in St. Louis, that deep southwestern theatrical display of red and orange and something almost purple at the horizon. "Your grazing rotation," she said. "Did your father develop it?" "I did," he said. "My father ran the cattle harder, conventional thinking." "Where did you learn the rotation system?" He was quiet for a moment. "I read," he said. "Agricultural journals mostly, anything I could get. And I talked to a cattle operation manager in Texas a couple of years ago who had worked on ranges in Argentina. Different system down there." He paused. "People look at me and see a rancher. They don't expect me to have read much." "People look at me and see a woman," she said. "They don't expect me to understand a water table." He turned and looked at her then, and there was something different in his expression, a recognition, quiet and direct, that felt more intimate than anything she had yet experienced in his company. "No," he said, "I suppose they don't." "They're always wrong," she said. "I'm beginning to understand that," he said. They sat in comfortable silence as the stars came out over New Mexico, and Louise Townsend told herself very firmly that she was a professional and that she had a report to complete. She completed it on the 5th day. It was the most thorough land assessment report she had ever written. 22 pages of documented findings, including the water rights analysis, the soil composition data, the aquifer mapping, the cattle operation review, the full boundary survey confirmation, and her professional conclusions. The conclusions were unambiguous. The Rourke Ranch was a legally sound, financially viable, well-managed cattle operation with exceptional natural water resources and documented legal land rights. There were no grounds for condemnation, no legal vulnerabilities in the claim, and no basis for any challenge to the property's standing. She had also, in the final section, added something that went slightly beyond the standard scope of assessment. A specific notation about the spring water rights and their legal precedence under territorial law, with citations to the relevant statutes, in language clear enough that any land office clerk could understand it. It was, effectively, both an assessment and a legal defense. She knew exactly what she was doing when she wrote it. She sat at Wesley's kitchen table on the 5th night, long after he had gone to sleep, with the completed report in front of her, and she thought about what it was going to cost her. Harrison Blackwell had connections throughout the territory. He was on first-name terms with the territorial governor. He controlled 3 significant newspapers. When he decided to make an example of someone, he had the resources to do it thoroughly. She thought about her father, who had taught her that the work was only worth doing if you did it right. She thought about the spring water she had measured in the cold early morning light, and the way it ran clear and steady over limestone, and the way Wesley Rourke had talked about it with the kind of deep, specific love that a man only develops for something he has cared for over a long time. She sealed the report in an envelope, addressed it to the Territorial Land Office in Santa Fe, and in the morning she rode into Doña Ana and put it in the post before she could change her mind. It was only after she had done that, after the envelope had left her hands, that she realized she should tell Wesley what she had done. She rode back to the ranch and found him at the corral, working with a young horse that was not yet comfortable with a rider. He was patient with it in the same way he was patient with most things, not passive, but calm, consistent, absolutely clear in his communication. The horse was beginning to trust him. She stood at the fence and watched for a while. "I sent my report this morning," she said. He stopped and looked at her over the horse's back. "And it supports the legal standing of your property comprehensively. I've notified the Territorial Land Office directly rather than delivering it to Blackwell first." She paused. "He hired me to find problems. I found the opposite." Wesley was very still for a long moment. The horse shifted beside him and he steadied it with one hand automatically without looking away from Louise. "You know what he'll do," Wesley said. "I know what he'll try," she said. "I know what I did." "You'll lose the contract." "Already done," she said. "I'll lose more than the contract probably. But the report is accurate. The land office will have it on file. You'll have legal grounds to fight any condemnation proceeding with documented evidence." Wesley let go of the horse's lead and walked to the fence. He came to stand directly in front of where she was standing on the other side of the rails and looked at her with an expression she could not entirely read, something complicated, layered, deeply serious. "Why?" he said. It was the simplest possible question, and the one she had the most complicated answer to. She chose the simplest version of the truth. "Because it was the right thing to do," she said, "and because the ranch deserves to stand." He looked at her for another long moment, and then he said very quietly, "Thank you, Louise." It was the first time he had used her given name. She felt it the whole ride back to Doña Ana. She had planned to take the next available wagon back to Mesilla and then the train to Santa Fe, where she would face the consequences of what she had done with her usual practical directness. She had done what she needed to do, and now she needed to go deal with the fallout. What she had not planned on was the mud. 3 days of unexpected spring rain turned the road to Mesilla into something that more closely resembled a riverbed than a road, and the wagon driver she had arranged to hire refused, with colorful and extensive justification, to take her anywhere until the road cleared. She was therefore stranded in Doña Ana, in Mrs. Garfield's spare room, with nothing to do but wait and think. Wesley came on the second day of rain. He came into Mrs. Garfield's front room dripping from the brim of his hat and carrying, incongruously, a book, a battered agricultural journal, which he set on the table in front of her with the particular solemnity of a man offering something he actually values. "Thought you might want something to read," he said. "It has a survey of water table measurements across the Southern Territory. I thought it might be interesting to you, given your work." She looked up at him and felt something in her chest that she had been trying very hard not to name. "You rode 12 miles in this rain to bring me a book," she said. He pulled off his hat and turned it in his hands, which she had come to recognize as his version of self-consciousness. "The road's bad," he said. "Wanted to make sure you were all right." "I'm all right," she said. "I'm also not someone who needs looking after." "I know that," he said immediately, and the quickness of it, the complete absence of defensiveness or protestation, disarmed her utterly. I just wanted to be here, that's different. She looked at him for a long moment. He was still dripping slightly. There was mud on his boots and something hopeful and patient in his expression that had absolutely no business making her heart do what it was currently doing. "Sit down," she said. "Mrs. Garfield will have coffee." He sat. Mrs. Garfield produced coffee and then produced herself, with a proprietary warmth that suggested she had strong opinions about the appropriate progression of events. And for the next hour, the three of them talked about water tables and land law and the history of the southern Rio Grande Valley. And Louise noticed that Wesley held his own in the conversation with the ease of a genuinely well-read man, and she noticed that she was not surprised by this at all. When Mrs. Garfield eventually found reasons to be elsewhere, Wesley said, "You're going back to Santa Fe." "Yes," she said. "What happens then?" "Blackwell does what he threatened. I lose contracts. I find other work." She said it plainly because it was plain. It was a consequence she had chosen and she did not intend to dramatize it. "What if you didn't go back right away?" he said. She looked at him. He met her gaze without flinching. "The land office has my report," he said. "Blackwell will challenge it. He'll hire another assessor, someone who will find whatever he tells them to find. But your report is on record with your credentials behind it. It's going to matter. The thing is," he stopped. "The thing is," she said carefully, "the thing is that Blackwell is not going to just accept this. He's going to push. And when he pushes, it's going to help to have someone around who understands the documentation as well as you do." He paused. "I'm not asking you to sacrifice anything else. I'm asking if you consider staying a little longer. As a paid consultant, I can pay a fair rate." "You're asking me to stay and help you fight him," she said. "I'm asking you to stay," he said, and the slight emphasis was so small that she could have imagined it, and she was absolutely certain that she had not. The rain drummed on the window of Mrs. Garfield's front room. Louise looked at her hands, at the ink stain on her right index finger from 3 days of writing, at the small callus on her palm from the handle of her auger. She thought about Santa Fe, where a cold professional reckoning awaited her. She thought about the creek on the eastern boundary and the way it ran clear over limestone. She thought about a man who had ridden 12 miles in the rain to bring her a book. "A consulting rate," she said. "Standard terms." "Whatever you say," he said, and the relief in his voice was so quickly controlled that she might have missed it if she had not been paying close attention. She was always paying close attention. She moved back to the ranch the following day when the road became passable enough for a wagon, and she took up residence in the small room at the back of the adobe house that had apparently been used for storage, which Wesley cleared out with apologetic efficiency and furnished with a cot, a table, and a lamp. It was spare and clean and entirely adequate. What was less adequate was her ongoing attempt to maintain professional distance. The days settled into a rhythm that was, on the surface, entirely practical. Louise worked on the legal documentation that would support the water rights defense. Wesley ran the ranch. They met at meals, which became longer and more elaborate as the days passed. Not because either of them was trying to make them so, but because the conversation kept going, kept finding new directions, kept demonstrating to both of them how rarely they had encountered someone whose mind worked in ways they found genuinely interesting. She learned that he had grown up on this land, the son of an Irish immigrant father and a mother who had died when he was 8, that he had educated himself largely from the contents of a small trunk of books his mother had left, that he had expanded the original homestead claim by buying adjoining land with the proceeds of his first good cattle year, that he had refused 3 separate approaches from Blackwell's men, and had done so politely, but with an absolute finality that apparently baffled Blackwell, who was not accustomed to refusals. He learned that she had grown up in St. Louis in a household that ran on her father's intellectual obsession with land law and the particular southwestern geology that made water rights such a complex and contested field, that she had worked alongside her father from the time she was 15, that she had taken her first solo contract at 23 to a doubting client who tried to pay her half rate, until her report proved so thoroughly superior to anything he had previously received that he paid the full amount plus a letter of reference, that she had no family left in St. Louis, and no reason she had to be anywhere but where she chose. That last part was something she told him on an evening when they had walked out after supper to check on the northern fence line, not because it needed checking really, but because neither of them had suggested going back inside and the stars were doing their particular New Mexico extravagance above them. No family, he said. No partner. No partner, she confirmed. Men find my work intimidating generally, or they find me intimidating. She paused. I've found it's difficult to love someone who wishes you were simpler. That seems like a fundamental incompatibility, he said. It is, she said, so I stopped looking. That seems like giving up on the wrong thing, he said quietly. She looked at him. The moon was up and she could see his face clearly, the line of his jaw, the careful way he was looking at the horizon rather than at her, the slight tension in his shoulders of someone who has said something true and is waiting to see what it costs him. Wesley, she said. I know, he said. I know what you'll say. You're here professionally. You're leaving when this is finished. I'm not, he stopped. I'm not trying to complicate things for you. What if I want things complicated, she said. He turned and looked at her then with a directness that was entirely characteristic of him and that she had come to find one of the most attractive things about him, his absolute refusal to look away from things that mattered. Louise, he said. I'm not simple, she said, and I'm not looking for someone who wants me to be, but if there's someone who doesn't want that, she stopped. I don't want you to be anything other than what you are, he said. Which is the most exceptional person I've met in my life. She looked at him for a long moment, this man standing in the moonlight of his own land, a man who had built something genuinely fine from the ground up, who read agricultural journals from Argentina, who rode 12 miles in the rain to bring someone a book, who had listened to her speak about water tables and aquifer formations with the focused attention of someone who found everything she said genuinely interesting. That's a considerable statement, she said. I mean it, he said simply. She stepped toward him, and he stood very still as she did, as if any movement might break something that he was not willing to risk breaking. She reached up and touched his face, and his eyes closed for just a moment, and then he brought his hands up and covered hers, and the night around them was very quiet. He kissed her with the same quality that characterized everything else. He did careful, focused, entirely present, and much more powerful than its apparent simplicity would suggest. She felt it in every part of herself, right down to her ink-stained fingers, and she thought that whatever came next, whatever Blackwell did, whatever contracts she lost, she had made every right choice that had brought her to this exact moment in this exact moonlit field. Then the next morning, things got significantly more complicated. The rider arrived before breakfast, a young man on a lathered horse from Santa Fe with a letter from the Territorial Land Office. Louise recognized the official seal and opened it at the table while Wesley stood by the stove. The letter informed her, in careful official language, that Harrison Blackwell had lodged a formal complaint against her assessment report, challenging her credentials, her methodology, and with particular malice, her objectivity, suggesting that she had developed a personal bias toward the property owner that had compromised her professional findings. Blackwell had furthermore hired a replacement assessor, a man named Garrett Cole out of Albuquerque, who had already conducted a preliminary survey and was prepared to file a contradictory report suggesting significant problems with the property's water rights claim. There was more. Blackwell had also, through his political connections, raised the question of whether Louise Townsend was legally entitled to conduct official land assessments at all, given that the territorial licensing statute's language written in 1875, before any woman had applied for such a license, was ambiguous on the question of female practitioners. It was the trap she had known was coming, and it was more comprehensively sprung than she had anticipated. She read the letter twice. Her face was calm, her hands were steady. "Tell me," Wesley said from across the kitchen. She told him. He listened without interrupting, and she watched his expression move through something anger, she thought, and something else underneath it, something protective and fierce, and then settle into the same careful steadiness she had come to rely on. "What do you need?" he said. Not "what are you going to do?" "What do you need?" She appreciated the distinction enormously. "I need to go to Santa Fe," she said. "I need to appear before the land office in person with my complete documentation, and I need to defend the methodology of my report directly against Cole's contradictory findings." She paused. "And I need to address the licensing question before Blackwell has time to develop it further." "I'm coming with you," he said. "Wesley, this is my land," he said. "And you're being attacked because you told the truth about it. I'm coming with you." She looked at him. He was not asking. He was not posturing. He was simply stating a fact with the quiet certainty of a man who had already decided, in the particular way he decided everything, that this was right. "The road is open to Mesilla," she said. "We can catch the northbound train tomorrow morning. I'll have the horses ready at 4, he said. And then, with a slight deliberateness that was very characteristic of him, he set her coffee cup on the table in front of her and went out to start the morning work. They reached Santa Fe on the second evening. After a long train journey during which Louise studied her documentation, and Wesley read the agricultural journal she had apparently been keeping on the compartment seat, and she looked at him at one point and felt so overwhelmed by the fundamental rightness of his presence that she had to look away. She had wired ahead, and they arrived to find a letter waiting at the hotel desk from an attorney she knew professionally. A man named James Whitfield, who specialized in territorial land law, and who was one of the few people in the territory with enough standing to push back against Blackwell's political connections. He had seen her assessment report in the land office records, had understood immediately what it represented, and had been waiting for her to come and fight. The meeting in his office the following morning was the kind of professional encounter that Louise found bracing sharp minds working quickly through complex material, no time wasted on anything but the substance of the problem. Whitfield laid out the legal situation with the precision of a surgeon. Blackwell's challenge had 2 prongs: the professional credentials attack, targeting Louise's report specifically, and the licensing ambiguity attack, targeting her right to conduct assessments at all. Both needed to be answered simultaneously, because allowing either one to stand would damage not just her career, but the legal standing of her report. "The licensing question is actually the easier one," Whitfield said. "The 1875 statute's language is ambiguous, as Blackwell correctly notes, but ambiguity cuts both ways. There is no explicit exclusion of women. She has held the license for 4 years without challenge. We argue that the license was validly issued and cannot be retroactively invalidated." "And the report challenge?" Wesley asked. He had been sitting across the table from Whitfield, quiet and attentive, contributing almost nothing except the occasional precise question, and Louise had noticed Whitfield beginning to reassess him about halfway through the meeting. "The report challenge is more interesting," Whitfield said, and glanced at Louise with something that was, from a man of his reserve, practically enthusiasm. "Because the challenge relies on Cole's contradictory survey, and I've read Cole's preliminary report." He paused. "It's wrong." "In what way?" Louise said. "In the water rights section," Whitfield said. "Cole argues that the spring source is on federal land, and that the flow rights claimed by the 1871 filing are invalid under the amended federal land regulations of 1878. He cites the 1878 statute specifically." Louise was very quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The 1878 statute applies to new claims filed after its enactment. The Rourke water rights claim was filed in 1871. It's explicitly grandfathered under the savings clause of the 1878 law." "Correct," Whitfield said, with the satisfaction of a man who has just watched someone else arrive at the conclusion he already held. "Cole either doesn't know the savings clause exists," Louise said, "or he knows and is hoping no one else does." In my experience of Garrett Cole, Whitfield said, the answer is the second option. Louise looked at Wesley. He was looking at her with an expression she would carry with her for the rest of her life, that particular combination of deep respect and something warmer, something personal, something that had been building since a rain-soaked morning in a spare room of a boarding house in Doña Ana. "We need to appear before the Land Office Review Board," she said. "Can you arrange it?" "I already have," Whitfield said. "The day after tomorrow." The day between the meeting and the hearing was one of the longest days Louise had spent. She worked through her documentation with the focused intensity that had always been her greatest professional weapon, but she was also deeply aware of Wesley's presence in the hotel's small sitting room, where he spent the afternoon reading and occasionally asking her questions that invariably turned out to be exactly the right questions. At one point, she stopped and looked at him across the table and said, "You understand the savings clause argument?" He looked up. "I read the 1878 statute on the train," he said, "and the 1875 case that established the precedent for its interpretation. Whitfield left a copy in his letter." "When did you?" "While you were sleeping," he said. "I didn't want to ask you questions I could find the answers to myself." She stared at him for a moment. He met her gaze with perfect equanimity. "Wesley Rourke," she said. "Yes." "I want to be very clear about something," she said. "All right," he said, setting down the papers. "I have spent my entire adult life doing this work in a world that assumed I could not do it. I have never once needed someone to defend me or fight my battles or carry my documentation or—" She stopped. "Started again. "I don't need someone to rescue me." "I know that," he said. "But I want to tell you," she said, and her voice, to her own surprise, was not as steady as she usually kept it, "that what you've done in the past 2 weeks, the way you've been present, the way you've listened, the way you read the 1878 statute at midnight on a train, that's not rescuing. That's something else entirely. And I don't have a word for it, but it means a great deal to me." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I think the word is partnership." She looked at him. "That's what it means to me," he said, "if that's something you'd want." "Yes," she said, "that is exactly what I would want." He smiled then, a slow, genuine smile, the kind she had seen very rarely because he was not a man who smiled carelessly. And she thought that she had never made a better decision in her life than riding out from Santa Fe 6 days ago to assess a ranch in the Southern Territory. The hearing before the Territorial Land Office Review Board convened at 9 in the morning in a room that smelled of old paper and the particular dusty authority of official proceedings. Harrison Blackwell was present, accompanied by his attorney and by Garrett Cole, who was a compact, neatly dressed man of 50, with the careful eyes of someone accustomed to finding whatever he had been paid to find. Louise stood before the board with her documentation arranged on the table before her, and she felt the familiar, bracing clarity that always came to her when she was doing the most important version of her work. She presented her case systematically, beginning with her credentials and the legal standing of her license, which she established with 4 years of completed contracts, 6 professional references including 2 territorial judges, and a direct statutory argument from Whitfield that was clean and unassailable. The licensing challenge dissolved within 20 minutes. Then she turned to the substance of the report. She walked the board through the water rights claim with the thoroughness of someone who had spent a week on the ground measuring, testing, and documenting. She presented her aquifer data. She presented her creek flow measurements. She presented the historical continuity of the water rights claim from 1871 to the present, with every legal filing in its place. And then she addressed Cole's contradictory findings. She did it with courtesy. She was always courteous in these proceedings, because courtesy was more devastating than contempt when you were right and your opponent was wrong. And she walked through his water rights analysis point by point, identifying the error in his reading of the 1878 statute, citing the savings clause, citing the 3 relevant territorial court decisions that had applied it, demonstrating clearly and without any rhetorical embellishment that Cole's conclusion was legally incorrect. Cole, to his credit, sat quietly throughout this. Blackwell's attorney tried once to interrupt and was gently but completely overruled by the board chair, an elderly man named Harrington who had been reviewing land disputes in the territory for 20 years and who was clearly following Louise's argument with close attention. When she finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Then Harrington said, "Miss Townsend, your 1871 rights precedence argument, you're citing the Callaway decision from 1880. And the subsequent Torres decision from 1882, she said, and produced both from her documentation without pause. Harrington said, which in the context of 20 years of his particular brand of territorial land law adjudication was the rough equivalent of thunderous applause. Blackwell's attorney made his counterargument, which lasted 40 minutes and was, in Louise's professional assessment, a technically adequate piece of legal reasoning built on a factually incorrect foundation, which made it ultimately useless. She sat quietly through it, making small notes in her notebook, and did not respond except when directly asked a question by the board. The hearing recessed for an hour. During the recess, Louise and Wesley sat in the corridor on a wooden bench, and he poured coffee from a flask he had apparently acquired at some point and handed her a cup without commentary. "That went well," he said. "The outcome is not certain," she said. "No," he agreed. "But it went well." She drank the coffee. It was stronger than she preferred, but it was hot, and it was exactly what she needed. She leaned back against the wall and let herself, just for a moment, feel the full weight of the past 2 weeks. "Whatever happens in there," she said, "I want you to know that I don't regret any of it." He turned and looked at her. "The contract, the confrontation with Blackwell, all of it," she said. "I would make the same choices." "I know you would," he said. "So would I, looking back at everything I've decided in the past 2 weeks. He paused. "I'm not a man who makes decisions quickly, Louise. When I decide something, it tends to stay decided." She understood what he was telling her. She turned it over in her mind carefully, the way she turned everything over, looking at it from all angles. But the angles all said the same thing, and had said the same thing since the night in the field when she had stepped toward him and he had stood perfectly still and let her make that choice freely. "So do I," she said. The board returned a decision in 90 minutes, which Whitfield later told her was unusually fast, and the decision went comprehensively in favor of the Rourke Ranch. Louise's assessment report was affirmed as professionally sound, methodologically correct, and legally sufficient. The licensing challenge was dismissed. Cole's contradictory report was entered into the record as factually flawed and given no evidentiary weight. The Rourke water rights claim was confirmed as valid and protected under the 1871 filing and the 1878 statute's savings clause. Any condemnation proceeding against the property based on the challenged grounds would be without legal foundation. Harrison Blackwell sat very still in his chair at the respondent's table as the decision was read. He looked, Louise thought, like a man who was already calculating his next move, because men like Harrison Blackwell always had a next move. But he also looked, for the first time since she had met him, like a man who had been genuinely beaten. She felt no particular triumph about it. She felt the clean, practical satisfaction of a job done correctly, of a truth that had been documented accurately and defended successfully. That was what her work was for. Outside the land office building, on the Santa Fe Street in the bright spring afternoon, Whitfield shook both their hands with the particular warmth of a man who had enjoyed a professional fight. Wesley shook his hand and said something that made Whitfield laugh. Louise stood in the sunlight with her satchel over her shoulder and felt the city around her, the sounds, the horses, the foot traffic, the smell of food from a nearby establishment, all of it clear and vivid in the aftermath of concentrated effort. Wesley came to stand beside her. "Come back with me," he said. She looked at him. "To the ranch," he said. "Not to work, not as a consultant." He paused. "I have things I want to say to you that I think would be better said on home ground." She thought about Santa Fe, which was not really her home ground either. She thought about a spare room in an adobe house with a cot and a table and a lamp, which had been more comfortable than she cared to admit. "All right," she said. The ride south was very different from the ride north. The tension of the past week had released, and there was space now for other things. On the train, they talked without any particular agenda about his plan to expand the North Pasture the following season, about a series of articles she had been wanting to write on aquifer mapping methodology for a land survey journal in Philadelphia, about books they had both read, and the particular satisfaction of finding, unexpectedly, someone who had read the same things. He told her about his mother, the trunk of books, the few clear memories he had of a woman who had apparently been both gentle and very determined. He told her about the year after his father died, when he had run the ranch alone for the first time and understood for the first time what he actually had. He told her that he had never met anyone before Louise with whom he felt the particular kind of ease that made silence comfortable and conversation almost effortless. She told him about her father, about the apprentice years, about the first time she had gone into the field alone and come back with findings that her father reviewed and said simply, "Good work." She told him that those two words had meant more to her than any other professional recognition she had received since. She told him that she had spent so long constructing a life that was entirely self-sufficient because self-sufficiency was the only thing the world offered her reliably, that she had not quite realized how much she missed the particular warmth of having someone who wanted to know how she was. He listened to all of it with the same focused, unhurried attention he brought to everything. They arrived back at the ranch on a Thursday evening in mid-April. The air was warmer now than it had been when she first arrived, the spring advancing rapidly in this southern latitude, and the creek on the eastern boundary was running strong and clear. She could hear it from the porch. After supper, which they made together with the easy coordination of people who have shared a kitchen long enough to stop getting in each other's way, they went out to the porch and stood in the early dark, and the stars began their nightly extravagance, and Wesley said what he had said he wanted to say on home ground. "I love you," he said. "I want to say it clearly because I'm not a man who speaks obliquely about things that matter to me, and this matters to me more than anything I can think of." He paused. "I'm not asking you to give up anything that belongs to you, not your work, not your independence, not anything. I'm asking you to consider whether this, a small gesture that seemed to encompass the ranch, the evening, himself and her simultaneously, whether this could be something you want, whether I could be something you want." She looked at him in the starlight. 32 years old, steady and honest and more intelligent than he looked and more sensitive than anyone would have guessed from the outside. A man who made coffee without being asked and rode 12 miles in the rain and read legal statutes at midnight and stood very still in a field and let her make her own choices freely. "I love you too," she said. "I want to say that clearly as well because I also mean it." He reached out and took her hand and held it simply, his thumb moving across her knuckles, and they stood on the porch of the Rourke Ranch in New Mexico Territory in the spring of 1883 while the stars came out, and it was the most right either of them had felt in a very long time. What followed over the next several weeks was the particular happiness of two people who have found each other and are smart enough to know it, not a dramatic, turbulent happiness, but a deep, working kind, the kind that gets built day by day through shared meals and shared work and shared conversation, and the accumulated trust of showing up honestly over time. Louise wrote to James Whitfield to ask whether he might have use for a land assessment specialist who also understood the territorial legal framework particularly well, and Whitfield responded within the week with a proposal that surprised her. He was expanding his practice and wanted to offer her a formal consulting arrangement on a long-term basis, working on whatever cases she chose, at her own standard rate plus a significant retainer. The arrangement would keep her based wherever she preferred and would give her not just the contracts she wanted, but the institutional backing that would protect her from future attacks on her licensing. She accepted by return mail and showed the letter to Wesley at breakfast. He read it, set it down, and said, "Whitfield is a smart man." "He is," she said. "Good for you," Wesley said, with simple, genuine pleasure, and went back to his eggs. She thought then, watching him, that she had perhaps needed most of her life to understand that those 3 words, said simply, and without any complicated emotion underneath them, "good for you," were among the most romantic things one person could say to another. Harrison Blackwell did not disappear from the world, because men like Harrison Blackwell never do. He made 2 further approaches to the Rourke ranch over the following year through intermediaries, offering prices that escalated substantially, first at fair market value, then at a considerable premium, as the railroad spur route became not a rumor but a confirmed plan. Both times, Wesley declined. The second time, he declined through Whitfield's office in language that made clear that any further approach would be treated as harassment. Blackwell eventually rerouted his land acquisition strategy north of Doña Ana, where he found ranchers more willing to sell. The railroad spur was built in 1886, and it ran about 4 miles east of the Rourke property, close enough that the nearest junction town grew substantially and made the ranch's location considerably more valuable, but far enough that the ranch itself was not affected in any material way. The irony was not lost on Louise when she calculated it. Blackwell had spent enormous resources trying to force Wesley off land that, had he simply built his railroad corridor where the terrain actually dictated he should build it, he would never have needed. But Louise was spending less time by 1886 on irony and more on other things. She and Wesley were married in the fall of 1883. A quiet ceremony in Doña Ana with Mrs. Garfield in attendance and James Whitfield making a special trip from Santa Fe, and a few neighboring ranchers and their families, and a celebration afterward at the ranch that involved considerably more food than Wesley had originally estimated the gathering would need, which turned out to be fine, because the celebration went on considerably longer than expected as well. Louise kept her professional name for work purposes, which caused some raised eyebrows and some comment, and she addressed the comment once directly at a social gathering in Doña Ana, where a merchant's wife made a pointed remark about the unconventional arrangement. Louise said, pleasantly but with the particular clarity that was her most effective social weapon, that she had built her professional reputation under her name through 10 years of work, and saw no reason that marriage should require her to abandon it, and then moved the conversation on with such smooth efficiency that the merchant's wife found herself discussing the spring cattle market before she quite understood how it had happened. Wesley, who had been standing nearby and heard the exchange, said afterward on the ride home, "You're formidable, you know." "Thank you," she said. "It was a compliment," he said. "I know," she said. "I accepted it as one." He laughed. That rare, full laugh that she had discovered was one of the best sounds she had ever heard, and the horses moved steadily south under the enormous western sky. She continued her assessment work through Whitfield's firm, taking cases that interested her and declining those that did not, traveling when the work required it and returning when she could. Wesley managed the ranch with the same quiet excellence she had documented in her first report, expanding the north pasture as he had planned, developing the aquifer understanding she had started and pushing it further with his own extensive reading, and some correspondence he had established with a hydrological surveyor in Denver. They were in many ways 2 people who worked in parallel different fields, different methods, the same underlying commitment to understanding things deeply and getting them right. In the early spring of 1884, she confirmed what she had suspected for about 3 weeks, and she told Wesley one morning at breakfast with a directness that was entirely characteristic of her, and he put down his coffee cup and looked at her with an expression that she had not seen on his face before, something so open and unguarded that it made her throat tight. "Are you well?" was his first question. Everything is fine," she said. "I am very well." He came around the table and took both her hands, and held them, and the morning light came through the kitchen window, and she thought that her careful, constructed, entirely self-sufficient life had become something she had not built at all, had not calculated or planned for, and was better for it than anything she had planned. Their son was born that October, in the adobe house with a doctor from Doña Ana in attendance and Mrs. Garfield, who had appointed herself an essential presence at the event, and was not wrong to do so. He was named Thomas Daniel Rourke, Thomas for Wesley's father and Daniel for Louise's, and he had his father's dark hair and his mother's particular expression of focused alertness that Wesley recognized immediately and found deeply funny. "He's already assessing something," Wesley said, looking at the baby with wondering seriousness. "He's 3 hours old," Louise said, exhausted and entirely happy. "He looks very thorough," Wesley said, and she laughed despite herself. Thomas grew up on the ranch with the particular richness of a childhood spent on good land, learning from a father who knew every inch of it, and a mother whose knowledge of the land extended into dimensions that other ranchers' families couldn't access: the legal frameworks, the geological principles, the broader territory maps that put the ranch into context. By the time he was 4, Thomas Rourke could identify 6 different soil types by texture and name 3 spring wildflowers correctly, because his parents taught him things, and because he was very much his parents' son. Louise's professional work evolved through the mid-1880s in ways she had not anticipated. The Whitfield consulting arrangement had given her the institutional backing that changed her position in the territory's professional landscape. Where she had previously been an independent woman assessor that clients hired with varying degrees of reluctance, she was now affiliated with the territory's most respected land law firm, which reframed everything. The reluctance did not entirely disappear, because this was 1885 and not a more enlightened time, but it diminished substantially, and the quality of the cases she was offered improved considerably. She wrote the series of articles on aquifer mapping methodology that she had mentioned to Wesley on the train, and they were published in a Philadelphia Land Survey journal and subsequently cited in 3 territorial court decisions, which gave her a kind of professional recognition that went beyond the territory and brought her, unexpectedly, a letter from a land law professor at a college in Missouri who wished to reprint her work in an anthology he was compiling. She agreed, and the letter that came back from him was the first time anyone had addressed her in print as a leading authority on the subject. She showed Wesley the letter. He read it at the kitchen table, set it down, and looked at her with the expression she had come to associate with his deep, specific happiness. Not the broad grin he occasionally produced, but this quieter thing, a settling and a warmth in his face that she found she could locate from across a room with no difficulty. "Leading authority," he said. "So it says," she said, trying not to show how much it meant to her and not quite succeeding. "Come here," he said, and when she did, he took her face in both his hands and kissed her with a thoroughness that was entirely characteristic of everything he did. "You have always been a leading authority," he said. "The rest of the world is simply catching up." She pressed her forehead against his and decided that, for a man who had not read much sentiment in his mother's trunk of books, he was remarkably gifted at it. In the spring of 1886, Blackwell made his last move against the ranch, and it was not a legal move. It came in the form of a rumor, the kind of carefully placed, strategically spread rumor that men like Blackwell deployed when legal options had been exhausted. The rumor went that the Rourke water rights claim, while legally sound on its face, had been obtained in 1871 through a false representation in the original homestead filing. That Thomas Rourke, Wesley's father, had misrepresented the acreage of his initial claim to secure a more favorable boundary position. The rumor had no factual basis. Louise knew this because she had read every document in the original 1871 filing during her first assessment. But rumors do not require factual basis to cause damage, particularly in a territory where reputation and neighborly trust were the practical currency of daily life. When she heard about it from Mrs. Garfield, naturally, who remained the most reliable news network in the Southern Territory, she felt the particular cold anger that she reserved for deliberate dishonesty. She went home and told Wesley, who listened with his eyes on the middle distance and his jaw set in the way she had learned to recognize as him managing a very controlled version of something large. "It's not true," he said. "I know," she said. "I have the documentation to prove it. Every inch of that original claim is verifiable." "Blackwell knows it's not true," Wesley said. "Of course he does," she said. "That's not the point. The point is what it does before it gets corrected." He stood up from the table, walked to the window, and stood looking out at the south pasture for a long moment. Then he turned back. "What do we do?" he said. She had already been thinking about it. "We get ahead of it," she said. "We don't wait for anyone to come to us with questions or doubts. We go to the county seat. We file the original documentation with the county clerk's office as a public record, not just in the land office, but in the public record where anyone can review it. We invite the neighboring ranchers who have questions to come and look at it themselves. We make the defense public before the attack develops momentum," he said. "Exactly," she said. They drove to Las Cruces, which was the county seat, the following week. Louise had prepared a complete bound compilation of the original 1871 filing documentation, the subsequent survey verifications, and the 1883 Land Office Board decision, with a clear explanatory summary written in language accessible to a non-specialist. They filed it with the county clerk, who stamped it with appropriate officiousness, and then they spent the afternoon going to the offices of the two local newspapers and providing each editor with a copy. One editor, a young man named Pollock who had a reformist inclination and found land speculation, abuses a subject of genuine journalistic interest, ran a story the following week that laid out the facts of the Rourke water rights claim and the documented legal confirmation of its validity in language clear enough that any reader could understand it. He also noted, without using Blackwell's name but with a specificity that anyone familiar with the territory's recent land history would immediately recognize, that the rumor appeared to originate with a party whose previous legal challenges to the same claim had been rejected comprehensively by the Territorial Land Board. The rumor died within a month. Blackwell's name was not mentioned in print, but the people who mattered understood what had happened. Several of the neighboring ranchers came to the Rourke ranch in the weeks following the newspaper story, some to look at the documentation, as Louise had suggested, some simply to shake Wesley's hand and say they hadn't given the rumor much credit anyway. Blackwell moved his operations entirely north that summer, following the railroad money to the Albuquerque corridor. He remained a powerful figure in the territory, but he never approached the Rourke ranch again. Whether this was a strategic calculation or a rare instance of a man choosing not to provoke something he had already clearly lost, Louise could not say. She did not spend significant time thinking about it. There were better things to think about. By the late summer of 1886, Thomas was almost 2.5 and had developed strong opinions about the horses, which he communicated with considerable volume. Wesley was in the process of negotiating a long-term grazing agreement with a neighboring property that would substantially expand the cattle operation scale. Louise had been engaged by Whitfield's firm on a complex water rights dispute in the Northern Territory that required 6 weeks of intensive work and 3 separate field surveys, and had completed it with findings that resolved the dispute in a way that satisfied both parties, which, Whitfield told her with genuine admiration, was a result he had not expected, and that required a level of technical creativity he had not known was available to the problem. She came home from that engagement on a Friday afternoon in October, tired from the train and the wagon ride from Mesilla, and found the ranch in its familiar state of productive peace. The cattle visible on the north pasture, the smoke from the kitchen chimney, the sound of Thomas's voice from somewhere around the barn, and Wesley coming out from the corral when he heard the wagon. He helped her down from the wagon with one hand, took her bag with the other, and held her for a long moment in the late afternoon sun with the straightforward completeness of a man who had been waiting for his wife to come home and was simply glad she had. "Thomas has been asking about you," he said into her hair. "What did you tell him?" "That you were doing important work," he said. "He accepted that." She pulled back and looked at him. He looked, as he always looked to her, like someone she had known long enough that his face had become part of her sense of what home meant. "I want to tell you something," she said. He waited. "I've been thinking on the train about the next few years," she said. "The Whitfield work is very good. The aquifer articles have opened doors I didn't expect. I could build the work in the next 5 years into something quite significant if I direct it carefully." "Yes," he said, "you could." "And I also," she said carefully, "may be expecting another child." He was very still for a moment. "Maybe," he said. "AM," she corrected. "I'm quite confident. I've been noting the signs for 3 weeks." He put both arms around her then and held her with a careful, thorough warmth, and she felt the same thing she felt every time he held her, the remarkable, impractical, entirely unscientific sensation of being exactly where she was supposed to be. "The work," he said after a moment. "That's still entirely what I want," she said. "I'm not stopping, but I wanted you to know." "I want whatever you want," he said. "You know that." "I do know that," she said. "It still bears saying." He kissed her temple, and then Thomas came running around the corner of the barn at high speed, yelling his mother's name with the full-lung enthusiasm of a small person who has recently developed a running capability and has not yet found a reason not to use it constantly. Louise crouched down and caught him as he arrived, and he grabbed both her shoulders and announced with great urgency that there was a new foal in the barn and that it was the best thing he had ever seen. She stood up with him in her arms and looked at Wesley over Thomas's head, and Wesley smiled, that rare, genuine, complete smile. And she thought that she had been right, that first morning on the porch of Mrs. Garfield's boarding house, when she had told herself that the smile of a man who did not smile carelessly was worth considerably more than the smiles of men who did it freely. The second child was born in the late spring of 1887, in the same bedroom of the same adobe house, with the same doctor from Doña Ana and, of course, Mrs. Garfield. A girl this time, with Louise's lighter coloring and Wesley's dark eyes, who announced her presence in the world with a directness that was apparently characteristic from the very beginning. They named her Clara Margaret Rourke Clara for no one in particular, simply because they both found it right, and Margaret for Mrs. Garfield, who cried with magnificent composure when told, and then became the child's fiercest advocate for the entirety of her long life. Thomas, at 3, was not entirely certain what to make of his sister, but he was willing to observe her with the same serious focus he brought to the horses and the soil types his parents had been teaching him to identify, and within a month he had appointed himself her primary protector, a role he undertook with such solemnity that Louise had to excuse herself from the kitchen on one occasion because she was laughing and did not want to discourage the impulse. The ranch moved through the years with the particular rhythm of a well-run operation, seasons of hard work and seasons of recovery, years of good rain and years of drought, managed carefully by a man who understood his water table better than any rancher in the Southern Territory, years of strong cattle prices and years of difficulty navigated by 2 people who had chosen to face difficulty together and turned out to be very good at it. Louise's professional life grew in directions she had not fully predicted. The aquifer work became a recognized specialty within the territory and eventually beyond it. She was consulted on water rights disputes from as far east as Texas and as far north as Colorado. In 1889, when New Mexico Territory was engaged in the preliminary processes of statehood consideration, James Whitfield was part of the legal group drafting water law provisions for the eventual state constitution, and he asked Louise to serve as technical advisor on the water rights sections. She did, and 3 of the specific provisions she drafted were incorporated into the water law framework that would govern the state of New Mexico for decades. She was 33 years old when she did that work, sitting at her kitchen table in the adobe house in the Southern Territory, with the sound of her children outside and the sight of the creek on the eastern boundary visible from the window. She thought, finishing the draft of the 3rd provision late one evening, about the 1883 hearing in Harrington, the land office chair, saying, when she cited the Tor's decision. She thought about how far that particular chain of choices had brought her. Wesley came in from the last check of the evening and found her at the table. "Done," he said. "For tonight," she said. He poured water from the pitcher, set a glass beside her, and stood behind her chair, reading over her shoulder for a moment. "This is good," he said, meaning the draft. "It is," she agreed. "I want to say something," he said. She looked up at him over her shoulder. "I've been thinking about the early days," he said. "That first week you were here. The morning you came out of the house and told me what Blackwell was actually doing. You had every reason to just file a neutral report and go back to Santa Fe, every professional and practical reason, and you didn't." "No," she said. "I've thought about what kind of person makes that choice," he said. "The kind of person who does the right thing when it costs them something, when it costs them a great deal." He paused. "And I've thought about how that same person has built the kind of life she's built, and raised the children she's raising, and done the work she's done, and he stopped. "Wesley," she said, "I just want you to know," he said, "that every good thing in my life for the past 7 years has been because you walked off that wagon and shook my hand and knew what a water table was." She stood up and turned and looked at him, this man she had chosen in a moonlit field 7 years ago, who had never once tried to make her smaller or simpler or less than she was, who had built something fine with her and beside her and never confused the two. "Every good thing in my life," she said, "has been because I filed an honest report." "And lost the contract," he said with a small, genuine smile. "And lost the contract," she agreed. "Best decision I ever made." He took her face in his hands, as he had done on another October evening years before, and kissed her with the thoroughness that was his particular signature. And the lamp burned steady on the kitchen table, and the creek ran clear on the eastern boundary, and the children were asleep in their rooms, and the ranch held firm on its documented, defended, beloved ground. In the years that followed, the Rourke Ranch became something of a landmark in the Southern Territory, not because of its size, though the operation grew steadily through careful expansion, but because of what it represented. It was pointed to in later years by land law scholars as one of the cleaner examples of the legal mechanisms protecting homestead water rights, partly because of the 1883 Territorial Board decision, and partly because of Louise Townsend Rourke's published work, which cited the case repeatedly. Thomas grew up into a young man who had his father's patience and his mother's analytical mind, and his own particular gift for the cattle breeding side of the operation, which he developed through the same combination of reading and direct observation that had characterized his parents' respective expertises. He was 17 when he brought home his first serious idea for a selective breeding program and presented it to his parents at the kitchen table with the focused, slightly nervous intensity of someone who was not sure how it would be received. Wesley listened, asked 3 questions that Thomas had clearly anticipated, and one that he hadn't, and then said it was worth trying. Louise said it was an excellent idea, and then asked 4 more questions that Thomas also hadn't anticipated, which turned out to be exactly the right questions. And by the end of the conversation, Thomas had a substantially better version of his original plan. He thanked them both and went back to his room, and Louise and Wesley sat at the kitchen table in the lamplight, and Wesley said, "He's going to be very good." "He already is," Louise said. Clara, at 12, had her own opinions about horses, cattle, land law, water tables, and the overall management of the ranch, which she shared freely and which turned out to be, in aggregate, more often right than not. Louise watched her daughter with the particular warmth of a woman who had spent her life being the person in the room who knew the most and was least expected to, and thought that whatever Clara chose to do, she would do it completely. There were other children in time, a second son, James, named for James Whitfield, who was born in 1890, and who had from the beginning the particular quality of someone who would grow up to be kind and steady and utterly reliable, which he did. And in 1893, a third daughter, small and fierce and named Ruth, who at the age of 6 months had already demonstrated a personality that suggested the Rourke household was about to become considerably more interesting. Louise was 37 when Ruth was born, and she looked at the baby in her arms on that winter morning and thought about the woman she had been in 1883, getting off a train in Messilla with a leather satchel and a notebook and a completely self-contained professional life, and the woman she was now. In the same adobe house with 4 children and a husband and a body of published work and a drafting credit in the foundational water law of a state, and a creek running clear on the eastern boundary that she could have told you more about than anyone alive. She had not become less. She had become more, in every direction. Wesley came in when the doctor and Mrs. Garfield had settled things, and it was quiet, and he sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his wife and his newest daughter with an expression that Louise had learned, over 10 years, to read with complete accuracy. It was the expression of a man who could not quite believe his luck and was choosing to simply live inside it rather than analyze it. "Hello, Ruth," he said softly to the baby. Ruth, who was 3 hours old and had very definite opinions about everything, regarded her father with dark eyes and then, with what seemed like considerable deliberateness, grabbed his extended finger. "She's strong," he said. "Of course she is," Louise said. He looked up from the baby to her, and the smile that crossed his face was the kind that had always made her feel, despite herself, like the sun had come out from behind a cloud. "Thank you," he said. "For which part?" she asked. "All of it," he said simply. "Every part." She reached out and took his hand, the one that wasn't being held by Ruth, and held it the way she had held things her entire life, with deliberate, certain, complete intention. The spring of 1895 brought good rain to the Southern Territory, and the creek on the eastern boundary of the Rourke Ranch ran higher and clearer than usual. Louise walked the east fence line one April morning with her notebook out of old habit, making notes on the water level, feeling the particular pleasure of a woman who loves her subject and has never run out of reasons to pay attention to it. She was 39 and had more professional work than she could comfortably manage, and 4 children and a husband, and a ranch that she had had a small but not insignificant role in saving 12 years ago. And she noted this with the same careful precision she brought to water table data, comprehensively happy. Wesley found her at the northern bend of the creek, crouched down making a measurement. "Thomas has the new colts sorted," he said, coming up beside her. "Clara has opinions about the sorting." "What kind of opinions?" "The correct kind," he said. "She'll tell Thomas when she's ready." Louise made her note and stood. The morning was clear, and the air had the particular quality of a spring day in New Mexico that made everything look sharp and vivid, the distant mountains luminous, the long grass of the pasture bright green. "I want to extend the aquifer survey to the western property line," she said. "There may be a secondary source I haven't documented." "James can help you carry the equipment," Wesley said. "James is 12. "He's stronger than you think," Wesley said. "He's been helping me with the fence posts, and he follows instructions well." She looked at him. He was looking at the creek with the expression he wore when he was thinking about the land in the deep, particular way that had attracted her from the beginning, not ownership, but relationship. A man who understood something he loved. "All right," she said. "Next week." He looked at her then, and the morning light was full on his face, and he was 44 and had more lines around his eyes than he had at 32, and his hair was touched with gray at the temples, and she thought he was one of the most genuinely compelling people she had ever encountered in her life. which was exactly what she had thought on a spring afternoon 12 years ago when he had come out of the barn and walked toward her wagon with that particular economy of motion. "Louise," he said. "Yes," she said. "I was thinking about that first week," he said. "I do think about it sometimes. When you came out here not knowing what you were walking into and you figured out what Blackwell was doing and you made the choice you made." "I've thought about it too," she said. "I've thought about who I would be if you hadn't," he said. "If someone had filed the report Blackwell wanted, if I'd been fighting that alone without the documentation behind me." He paused. "I probably would have lost eventually. A man with no resources against a man with all of them, eventually the pressure tells." "You might not have lost," she said. "I might not have," he agreed. "But I want you to know that whatever else, the legal outcome, the land, all of it, what you gave me that week wasn't just the report. It was the understanding that there was a person in the world who would do the right thing at cost to herself, who would meet the world with honesty and not flinch." He stopped. "I want you to know that I have known, every day since then, exactly how fortunate I am." She looked at him for a long moment, at this man who had loved her as she was from the beginning, who had met her intelligence and her independence and her particular fierce honesty, not with reluctance or condescension, but with recognition, who had built a life with her that was the realest, truest thing she had ever been part of. "Wesley Rourke," she said. "Yes. I filed that report because it was right," she said. "But I have never for a single day regretted what came after." He stepped toward her, and she met him in the space between, and he kissed her there beside the creek on the eastern boundary of the Rourke Ranch on a clear spring morning in 1895, and the water ran steady over limestone behind them, and the distant mountains held their snow, and the land that had been defended and documented and loved was very much itself solid, alive, entirely theirs. Not by conquest, but by truth. Not by force, but by the particular, stubborn, irresistible power of a woman who told the truth in a document and changed the direction of both their lives. Thomas called from somewhere near the barn, something about the colts. Clara's voice answered with opinions as predicted. James was probably somewhere being quietly competent. Ruth, indoors with the housekeeper who came on Tuesdays, was probably pointing at something and explaining it to herself. Louise and Wesley walked back toward the house together through the spring grass, close enough that their shoulders touched, and the Rourke Ranch spread around them in every direction, everything documented, everything defended, everything loved. The creek ran clear. The land held firm. The story of it had started with a hired woman and a wrong assignment, and a choice that cost everything and gained more than could have been calculated. It had not ended. It was, in all the ways that mattered, still going.